One has to wonder what in the world happened that a small family cemetery outside of the very small town of Jenkins, Kentucky, would start to become known as Murdered Man's Cemetery. This is not something that happened overnight. As a matter of fact, it happened over a period of time. A lot of tragedy, a lot of heartbreak in this cemetery. Join me as we take just a small glimpse at what is now known as Murdered Man's Cemetery. We begin our journey today by walking up to a cemetery that is formerly known as Potter Cemetery, and I guess that is the technical name if you want to call it that, Potter Cemetery. But this cemetery over the years has taken on a much darker meaning and a pretty dark history, and we are going to try to cover some of that for you today. So much history here, I know we won't be able to get everything in here, but there's a lot that we're going to go over. This ended up being known as Murdered Man's Cemetery. And you may be wondering, why? Why is it called Murdered Man's Cemetery? Well, I will tell you why. It is reported that over the years, this cemetery actually holds the final remains of around 25 murder victims. I know that we have heard a lot about, especially with the popularity of the Hatfield-McCoy feud, a lot about that feud throughout the years, but in the hills of Kentucky, and we are pretty close to the Kentucky-Virginia border, which is, in this part of the country, you're basically in the hills, in the mountains. The Hatfield-McCoy feud is not the only feud to happen out of Kentucky, and there were some pretty bloody battles. And, back in those days, I mean, as sad and primitive as it sounds, a lot of people would try to put justice in their own hands. And, when that happens, this is the types of stories and the type of brutal, bloody history that you will get. So right now, we're just taking a look at the top of the hill, and I'm going to briefly mention a few of these stories while we are here. There's actually one called the Gap Massacre that I'm going to dedicate a larger video to somewhere down the line, because it is just an unbelievable story, how it all came about, and a brutal, bloody feud that would rival the feud that, for whatever reason, became famous from Kentucky and West Virginia, which is the Hatfield-McCoy feud. We're taking a look at these cemetery shelter houses. I did a video on that before, but these were actually found in this Murdered Man Cemetery. So I really thought that those were neat, so I wanted to show those to you. And here's the thing about the Murdered Man Cemetery. There are murdered men and women both in here. I mean, just a very, primitive, bloody battles that would happen. And you're seeing here at the bottom of the screen several members of the Mullins family. The Mullins family were involved and victims in that Gap Massacre. Gap is an area along the Kentucky-Virginia border. So that's where that name comes from. And Ira Mullins, you'll see the grave right there, was one of the chief people associated with that bloody battle. And they were murdered at a place that is now known as Killing Rock. More on that is coming. I'm not going to dig too deep into that, but just an unbelievable story. And we're going to tell that story on my channel. And if you look, we are just taking another general look through the cemetery. I just want to show you all some of these graves. Some very old graves in here, and also some, not so old. I don't know if this is still used for burials. I did see a veteran's grave that I will show you before we go that passed away in 2014. I believe that was the most recent grave that I had, that I seen actually while I was in the cemetery. But I've seen a lot of surname Potter, so I'm sure Potter Cemetery came from that last name. A lot of the Potter and the Mullins family buried here, and I am going to show you some of the stones in here as well. They were kind of hard to read, some of them, especially the ones with the age on them, so just wanted to show you all some of the stylings and the look of the stones that you'll see with the older graves that are in here. But I am also going to talk about a few other stories while we're in here as well. You're looking at the grave sites of the Kraft family, and the Kraft family had a few that were murdered within it, and really they said, from what I've read and the history, that it just started over some sort of a nonsense, basically just a quarrel, and it simply got out of hand. And you'll see a name of the last name Kraft there. Later in the video, I'm going to show you, and this was the father of the Kraft boys, who actually at one time swore revenge on those responsible for killing his sons. Not exactly sure how that panned out, but I'm actually going to come back and show you a grave marker of one of the Kraft boys that was actually murdered. I want to get a little bit closer on these just neat shelter houses. Johnny Newsom is the name of the person buried there, but I did a complete video kind of dedicated to these, and I asked for your all's opinion. Again, if this is the first time you're seeing this, I would love to hear your opinion on this as well. And we are coming upon the grave of Jane Belcher. Jane Belcher, from what I'm gathering, was a murder victim also. So, I mean, some of these, I'm sure there was definitely a story attached to her, but Jane Belcher, she was supposedly, from what I read, going to testify against someone in another murder case of this area, and the story is that someone wanted to silence her, prevent her from being able to testify, and that's what happened in this situation. Another member of the Mullins family, like I said, I wanted to show you all just some of the other gravestones that were in here while we were visiting here today. But it's amazing to me that up on the hills, or in the hills of Kentucky, I live more in the hills. I don't really live in the mountains. We're in the mountains here today. But there are just so many stories like this that are pieces of history that I know have been lost through time, poor record keeping and things like that. But, you know, I am glad to be able to find this story, albeit, I mean, this is terribly sad. And I mean, just, I guess the word that keeps coming to my mind is primitive, how, you know, the people of this day would handle their problems. And this is the veteran I was talking about. And you'll see there are different plots here with fencing and things around the plots within the cemetery. So, I mean, it was a very, very neat and historical place. And if you look that up online, Murdered Man Cemetery in Jenkins, Kentucky, you too can read some of the history. Again, there's just so much history involved in this. It is so hard to be able to tell everything in, you know, just a even a 10-minute video. I mean, that we're talking of years upon years of history here. David Kraft. This is the grave that I said we would come back and look at. He was one of the murder victims, and you can see there I'm sure the elements or what have you has caused the damage on that stone. But I definitely wanted to come back and show you his grave and his grave marker. But he was yet another murder victim. And, you know, there's just so many things up here to see, and I wanted to make sure that, you know, we show you as much as we can. But yeah, just another stone here. You can see most of the older stones, a lot of those had this particular look, and I just love looking at the old stones and the history and everything associated with the stones. Here is the grave of Henderson Mullins, yet another murder victim. Henderson Mullins. This, I mean, you can see the history. You can see why Potter Cemetery is now known. History remembers it as Murdered Man Cemetery. Several unbelievable stories and more stories from this cemetery coming your way. You know, there are just a ton of stories in this cemetery. I did touch on a number of those in this video. You know, as with any cemetery, it is nearly impossible to catch all of the history, but I am so glad to be able to find this particular cemetery. Thank you to Mrs. Whitdox, who has been so helpful to me in this channel, helping me find some of these places. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I am going to leave links in the description where you can find me, my Facebook, my Instagram, my merchandise. I would love to hear from you. And my channel is 100% cemetery related. All of my videos are either about or take place in a cemetery. Thank you once again to all 20,000 subscribers. If you haven't subscribed, it's totally free. Just please click on that subscribe button and join me on my future journeys. Once again, from Jenkins, Kentucky, I will see you again soon.